My name's Ryan Evans, and this new music is for a new show that we're previewing on this feed called Thinking the Unthinkable with Ankit Panda of the Carnegie Endowment. You should expect Ankit to challenge your views, whether you are a nuclear hawk or a nuclear dove, whether you're an arms controller or the opposite. Ankit will be having a ton of great guests on the show, much like Mike Kofman does on his show, The Russia Contingency. Think about this as that, but for nuclear issues. So I hope you enjoy my first discussion with Ankit. I asked him to begin by identifying 3 reasons why it's important to have a new show on nuclear issues now. Give me 3 reasons why now is the time for a new show on nuclear issues.
First, I think when we look around the world, we see nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence coming to the fore of international statecraft and strategy in a way that we really haven't in the 3 decades since the end of the Cold War. The second thing I would say is the advent of new technologies, fundamentally, I think, is leading a lot of folks who work on these issues to rethink longstanding assumptions about what it takes to truly afford strategic stability. And then third, in the regional context, when we look at the potentiality for nuclear crises, be it in South Asia, in Eastern Europe, or in the Taiwan Strait, we see the salience of nuclear weapons and potentially limited nuclear use scenarios becoming a lot more contemplatable than they were in the past. And I think that's really why, Ryan, this is exactly the right time to bring nuclear weapons to the forefront. Every national security practitioner, I think, working on defense, security, deterrence issues needs to reckon with the changing role of nuclear weapons in international statecraft in the 21st century.
This isn't your first podcast.
That's right, Ryan. It's not. I've been hosting the Asia Geopolitics podcast over at The Diplomat for about 10 years, just a few months shy.
And you love it so much, you're doing a new one with us.
That's right. Well, really, it's more that I have a lot of thoughts kicking around in my head about nuclear weapons issues and nuclear policy in general. And the beauty of the podcast format is it lets you kick ideas around without necessarily committing to them to print where they're searchable and you're on the record for all of recorded history as having expressed a view. So that's really the beauty of the podcast format. And I think we're facing a lot of tough questions in the nuclear policy community here in the United States and really around the world that I'm hoping to kind of interrogate on this show.
What are some of those issues that people should expect to hear about?
The way I find myself thinking about a lot of these issues is through the lens of a third nuclear age, right? So some listeners might be familiar with the literature on the second nuclear age back in the late 80s, early 90s. Broadly speaking, the end of the Cold War leads us into this period of, I think it's fair to say, general optimism around nuclear weapons. Sure, we're worried about proliferation on the Korean Peninsula and South Asia, but really, nuclear weapons are no longer at the forefront of international statecraft, especially in the 90s. And I think when we look at global nuclear dynamics today, and I'm not just talking about Vladimir Putin's nuclear threats in Ukraine, I'm also talking here about the arrival of a new large land-based solid fuel silo force in China, for instance, the arrival of North Korea as a normalized nuclear state, the implications of a whole range of non-nuclear strategic technologies that could influence the nuclear balance, the demise of arms control. There's a lot to kick around. And I think we're asking a lot of tough questions here in Washington about what all of this will mean for the future of U.S. nuclear strategy and force structures, the so-called two near-peer environment problem that you hear a lot about in these discussions that happen on nuclear policy in D.C. There's also really interesting, I think, nuclear governance issues around the future of nonproliferation. We have a debate about acquiring nuclear weapons in South Korea that I think is reaching a very interesting fever pitch in many ways. We'll be talking about this and a lot of other good stuff on this show that I'm hoping will be of great interest to all of our members.
And the title comes from, isn't it Herman Kahn or is it someone else?
I think the origin of that phrase does go back to Herman Kahn, but thinking the unthinkable is a bit of a cliche at this point, right? It's what those of us who think about nuclear war and hopefully avoiding nuclear war like to pretend that we're doing, but there is something, I think, fundamentally thinkable or contemplatable about nuclear use today. I think when you look at the nuclear doctrines of various states around the world and perhaps the defense establishments that contemplate nuclear weapons issues, including here in the United States, the problem of limited nuclear use, the idea that nuclear weapons might be usable without escalating to an all-out exchange that could be world-ending, is a more palatable idea now than it perhaps was during the Cold War. But, you brought up the title, Ryan, so I'm tempted to sort of riff on What's really interesting, I think, in talking through these issues and thinking about these issues, which is just the fundamental epistemic difficulty in studying nuclear deterrence, right? We have the low end problem. We have 2 recorded uses of nuclear weapons. We have 75 plus years of non-use. Why have nuclear weapons not been used? Is that because nuclear deterrence has truly prevented the rational resort to nuclear use by military establishments and world leaders? Or is it more a function of luck? Is it a function of arms control, of predictability being institutionalized, of restraint? And the field is full of these kind of open-ended questions, right? There's, of course, famous debates about whether non-proliferation is actually desirable or whether a more proliferated world can be more stable. The famous debate between Ken Waltz and Scott Sagan. We even debate the very nature of deterrence, right? Going all the way back to Tom Schelling and Albert Wohlstetter's fundamental cleavage between Schelling's idea that deterrence could be stable at fairly low numbers of nuclear forces because the mere presence of nuclear weapons in a crisis introduces just a tremendous level of caution on both sides. Arguably, we have good evidence of that in how both the United States and Russia have conducted themselves in the course of the Ukraine war. And Albert Wohlstetter's idea, of course, that has had a lot of practical impact on U.S. nuclear policy, which is that the balance of terror is actually very delicate. And so you have to concern yourself with precisely matching the adversary, warhead for warhead, capability for capability, leading to the massive ballooning we saw in nuclear forces during the Cold War. And these debates are far from resolved. There's passionate and evidence-based disagreements that continue to, I think, inform both sides of the conversation. And so we'll be kicking around a lot of those ideas on the show.
Let's march through some of the big topics that you just mentioned. So let's start with Russia. What I'd like you to do for each is just sort of highlight the 3 things you find the most interesting about each issue I'm about to bring up. So Russia's nuclear threats over Ukraine and non-use of nuclear weapons in the middle of one of the biggest wars in a very, very long time.
You know, the first observation I'd make is about the utility of nuclear weapons. If I have it right, I think Russia's performance in Ukraine makes it the singular, I think we've seen the singular highest level of casualties for any nuclear armed country in any conflict since the start of the nuclear age with Russia's performance in Ukraine. It used to be us in Vietnam, and I think the Russians have now exceeded that. And of course, nuclear threat making, the role of nuclear threat making in this conflict, I think, has been rather interesting, right? I think my interpretation of what Vladimir Putin and many Russian commentators who are close to the Russian political establishment have been doing is making sure that the prospect of nuclear escalation is well understood in the West, right? I think on the very first day of the war, when Putin alludes to the world seeing consequences of the like that have never been seen in history, he's alluding to the potential use of nuclear weapons, cautioning NATO to keep out from directly intervening in Ukraine. At the same time, Ryan, I think I'm thinking a lot now of, and this might be premature given that we can't really predict the future, but I'm thinking a lot about post-war Russia. What does a Russia on the other side of this conflict look like with regard to its reliance on nuclear weapons? Russia has 2,000 or so non-strategic nuclear weapons that I think are going to become a lot more prominent in its national defense strategy. I would expect potentially to even see revisions to Russia's 2014 military doctrine, which is the most up-to-date expression of its nuclear doctrine, and its 2020 basic principles of state policy on nuclear deterrence in a post-war environment. There's a lot of really good people doing very good work on Russian nuclear forces, including many who, of course, ride for War on the Rocks, and we'll definitely look to have many of them on the show to help us think through some of that.
All right, now let's turn to China. And China is in the midst of a really, I think it's not too much of an exaggeration to say, a remaking of its nuclear arsenal from one of focused on minimal deterrence to something much more akin to what we have and what Russia has in some ways.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, I talked about Schelling and Wohlstetter. I guess you could say the Chinese once were where Schelling was, and now they find themselves perhaps heading towards where Wohlstetter would advise them to go, in that when as an American, you look at a Chinese nuclear force that is adding 360 or so fixed silos in the Western desert, along with investments in early warning, you start to see something very familiar. And of course, the real disconcerting thing for Americans about the Chinese buildup is we don't just live in a world where the United States is in a geopolitical competition with China, but Russia is also a problem. And we don't have experience in navigating a world with 2 so-called near-peer nuclear adversaries. Multipolarity per se isn't a new problem, right? You look at the single integrated operational plan during the Cold War in the late 1960s after Mao tested the bomb. We just added a bunch of targets in China to the PSYOP, in addition to targets in Russia. But we can't do that now with the existing U.S. nuclear force. And the debate that's coming together around China is first and foremost, I think, about intentions. What is driving China's nuclear buildup? I can point you to extremely lengthy speeches by Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin that tell us quite a bit about what their theory of nuclear strategy and why they feel they need the forces that they do. I cannot point you to an analogous document or speech from Xi Jinping. And that is a problem, because without an accurate assessment of of intentions, I think the United States and perhaps even many countries in the region, I think, risk reacting poorly to the Chinese buildup. And so when we think about prescribing a course of action for the United States in responding to China, understanding the logic of the Chinese buildup, I think, is quite important. Is there an offensive logic to this? Is this something that is being done because China has designs on Taiwan and understands that the United States will be deterred by a larger Chinese nuclear force, all else being equal? Or is there a more defensive, benign logic that, all else being equal, a Chinese nuclear force that is larger and more survivable will give Chinese leaders more confidence in a conflict to not resort to nuclear use? So we'll turn to many of these questions, I'm sure, in the course of this debate. I've done a lot of writing on this. I think members should know that I spent a lot of my time thinking mostly about nuclear issues in the context of the Asia-Pacific, where I would argue most of the action in the third nuclear age will probably end up when it comes to the interesting open-ended questions. But of course, like we just said, Russia's not going anywhere, and that will continue to be a focus as well.
Great. Well, you mentioned North Korea and Kim Jong-un. One of the things that's been striking about, U.S. policy in terms of what the actual policy is, which is denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, hasn't really changed, even through Trump's negotiation efforts. And by contrast, North Korea's nuclear capabilities have changed quite a lot, creating very much a new reality. What are your high-level thoughts on the North Korean nuclear threat? And you could disagree with anything I just said, of course.
No, I don't think I disagree. I would say that, and I have said this for a number of years now, the U.S. needs to recognize that this is not a non-proliferation problem, right? This is a horse that left the barn a long time ago, and it's not going back. As a horse that's building tactical nuclear weapons, MIRVs, and multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, and all sorts of new things that are, I think, significantly expanding the type of threat that North Korea poses to the United States and our allies. It is a deterrence problem, and there's a lot of interesting debates in the context of the U.S.-South Korea alliance in particular on what exactly it will take to deter North Korea. But I would also argue that this is a strategic stability problem, and so it's one that merits the consideration of new tools in the U.S. toolkit, right? Risk reduction tools. Arms control might be a little far-fetched with North Korea, given the starting baseline, but eventually it is somewhere we will have to end up. I think the United States will coexist with a North Korea that is going to be in possession of nuclear weapons that can credibly range the U.S. homeland for years, if not decades to come. And so from the perspective of just the U.S. national interest, I think we ought to be doing more to shape the contours of this problem, which we're absolutely not. And the reasons for that, I think, are primarily political, bureaucratic, right? I don't think American presidents, perhaps with the exception of President Trump, see much benefit in sticking their necks out to change policy on North Korea, lest they be painted as capitulators, for instance. And similarly, within the bureaucracy, of course, right now, we've got a major war in Europe. We've got the, quote, pacing challenge of China. And so there's just not a lot of oxygen left over for thinking about North Korea. But certainly we've got a lot of oxygen to talk through that on this show. And North Korea is, of course, a big personal interest of mine, the subject of my first book, and something I'll be addressing in my upcoming research quite closely. So I'll hope to pull on some of that and talk to other smart folks, hopefully, who are doing good work as well.
Hope you're enjoying this first episode of Thinking the Unthinkable. It's, of course, a part of a whole bunch of new membership features. So let's just walk through the membership. First, we started in 2017 with the War Hall, a members-only forum, and the Warcast, a thrice-weekly podcast featuring 10-minute interviews with experts on major events of the week. Then in 2022, last year, we launched the Russia Contingency with Michael Kofman. We launched the War on the Rocks app. The following spring, earlier this year, we launched The Insider, another podcast, Unspent Rounds, another podcast, Mid-Afternoon Map, a newsletter, In Brief, another newsletter. And now we're launching this show with Ankit. We're launching 2 more newsletters called The Adversarial, which will feature brief analysis on America's major adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and jihadist terrorist groups. Another newsletter called Rewind and Reconnoiter. This one will feature conversations, interviews in newsletter form with past War on the Rocks authors from at least more than a year ago, revisiting the issues they were writing about. And 5 new podcasts, that's right, 5 new podcasts in the 5 military services, the U.S. Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and Space Force. We'll launch another show featuring interviews with book authors. We'll launch a newsletter focused on cyber operations and another podcast on artificial intelligence. So you're really getting more than you can get anywhere else on national security issues. That's what we're building here. We hope you'll join our tribe and be a member of our community. Thank you for listening, and back to my conversation with Ankit. Well, let's turn to Iran now. So the Obama administration enacted the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal with the P5+1. That was China, Russia, France, Britain, and us, I believe.
And the Germans.
The Trump administration did its best to break it and pretty much did. And the Biden administration's been trying to renegotiate a new nuclear deal and so far has not. And the effort has been mired in no small amount of controversy. So what are your big, high-level points you'd like to make about where we stand with Iran and what we fear is a nuclear weapons program?
Yeah, so that's the thing. I think the big question about Iran right now is Iran a threshold nuclear weapon state? I think the JCPOA is functionally irrelevant at this point, I think, in constraining Iran's civil nuclear program. There's a very interesting discussion to be had about the role of Iranian nuclear latency, right? They are the only non-nuclear weapon state sitting on a non-insignificant amount of highly enriched, or uranium enriched to 60%, which, despite what you may have heard, is closer than a lot of people think to weapons-usable, highly enriched uranium. They have a whole range of delivery systems. They're quite a capable missile power. We know from the archives removed from Iran by the Israelis that they have done experimentation with nuclear weaponization in the past. And so if Iran did choose to go nuclear, how would it choose to do so? When would it choose to do so? What would the consequences be for the international nuclear order, for the potentiality of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East? We have, of course, the United States considering quite the agreement with the Saudis, which may involve an enrichment capacity, precisely after the Crown Prince repeatedly keeps saying in explicit terms that Saudi Arabia would pursue nuclear weapons if Iran were to do so. And of course, Ryan, I'd love to be wrong about the JCPOA. There is still a diplomatic process. There are still negotiations to try to put the Iranians back into some kind of box. But I think fundamentally the problem now continues to be, I think, American politics when it comes to our non-proliferation efforts. And I don't just say this about the Iranians. I would also say this about the South Koreans. The prospect of American politics resulting in a government that would once again choose to walk away from any agreement that we forged with the Iranians, right? I think it's important to recall that in May 2018, when Donald Trump announced that the United States would withdraw from the JCPOA, the United States intelligence community had assessed that Iran was in compliance with that agreement. So the Iranians really, I think, saw themselves as gaining very little for complying with an agreement that they had reached after painstaking negotiations with the United States. And I think the consequences longer term for American non-proliferation diplomacy are rather grim. But we'll talk through this and more when it comes to the future of non-proliferation in the third nuclear age.
Nuclear technology, of course, is an older technology, and there's other technologies that are advancing at a faster rate that have possibly high impact on the way nuclear competition and nuclear weapons technology unfolds, everything from AI to cyber, advances in missile technology. Should we expect episodes on this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the most fundamentally interesting questions about the third nuclear age, right? Nuclear deterrence and nuclear strategy have always been highly responsive to new technological developments, right? The nuclear age did not begin with intercontinental range ballistic missiles and ballistic missile submarines that are continuously at sea with long-range SLBMs. Those were new technologies that arrived and fundamentally influenced the course of how nuclear strategy developed in the United States and the Soviet Union. What's interesting about this third nuclear age that we're in, I think, is the role of non-nuclear strategic technologies. Technologies that don't involve things that fission in particular, but do influence the course of how leaders and military planners might think about the prospect of nuclear escalation. How do we make sense of cyber attacks on nuclear command and control? How do we make sense of the revolution in precision leading to a whole range of conventional long-range precision strike systems, including many possessed by non-nuclear states that might influence the course of nuclear escalation. Listeners might have seen some of these debates in the context of providing the Ukrainians with certain long-range strike systems, which the argument is commonly heard that this is an escalatory choice because Ukraine could strike Russian facilities and storage sites involved with nuclear operations, potentially incentivizing Russian nuclear use where there otherwise might not have been a particular choice to use nuclear weapons. Other technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum sensing, there's a lot of hype out there about these technologies. We'll try to cut through the noise and get to the signal on what exactly these technologies stand to do when it comes to nuclear stability. I think, like with all things technological change in warfare, technology itself can be agnostic, right? There can be certain stabilizing consequences of certain types of technologies. My hope is to bring on some of the folks that are doing really, really good work, specifically within many of these domains, that may or may not think about nuclear weapons. But I think, in general terms, this is, I think, a really important inflection point with regard to technology. It's a lot of what I think we see in how various states are adopting their nuclear postures. I should point out here that I'm particularly interested in missile defense, which is, of course, a long-standing problem for strategic stability, and one that I think is taking on interesting contours as we've started to see the flip of the script from the Russians and Chinese primarily being worried about American missile defenses to increasingly more Americans being concerned about what Russia and China may choose to do with their missile defense systems. So, we'll certainly be thinking through all of that on the show.
And let's end on, what's been described in exaggerated fashion as the death of arms control. I say exaggerated because certain religious beliefs notwithstanding, death has something very final about it. But I do think that arms control is at least going into a very deep sleep, or so it seems.
I think I agree with you. Arms control is not dead, but it is decaying. And I think the good thing about the third nuclear age is that we lived through the first one and we discovered ultimately what arms control and negotiated restraint, including with adversaries, especially with adversaries, we don't really do arms control with our friends, can do for U.S. national interests, Soviet national interests. The problems for arms control, I think there are some novel problems, right? The three-body problem. How do you do arms control in a deeply multipolar environment? Is there a trade space that might reasonably make sense for the U.S., Russia, and China to talk about these things? This was a big focus during the Trump administration. It went nowhere. Arms control, I think, is also being recast fundamentally away from the old-fashioned legally binding treaties with the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate approach, which, don't get me wrong, is certainly desirable. But given political and practical realities, there is, I think, a rethinking going on in Washington and around the world of what arms control might look like in the third nuclear age. And something else I'm particularly interested in is verification. Right, verification, I think, often gets forgotten in discussions about arms control, particularly political discussions about arms control. But it's absolutely essential, and there's a whole body of really exciting work that I don't think gets enough sunlight on verification technologies. Does verification necessarily need to rely on inspectors with boots on the ground, so to speak, inspecting physical objects and ensuring that treaty accountable items are where they should be in the numbers that they should be in? Or can we rely on new types of verification to give us the political confidence necessary to make agreements with our adversaries? And finally, Ryan, I mean, the one thing I just want to say is, I think arms control when it comes to U.S. nuclear strategy continues to be a part of our toolkit, right? Defense, deterrence, and arms control, I think, are mutually reinforcing. And the idea that deterrence without arms control is more desirable because it unconstrains the United States, I think we learned quite early on into the nuclear age why that's an insufficient approach. The primary value of arms control for the warfighter, for the person focused on deterrence, for military planners, is predictability. All else being equal, I think military planners in particular want the world to be a little bit more predictable, given how unpredictable war itself can be. And so that will be, I think, a motivating theme for a lot of the discussions we'll be having about arms control on the show.
Thanks for listening to the first episode of Thinking the Unthinkable with Ankit Panda. This is Ryan Evans signing off. Stay safe and stay healthy.